even before dawn touched the rooftops. The streets of Rome were already groaning under the weight of wheels, hooves, and shouted orders. Wooden carts scraped over stone roads like tortured animals, their iron rims screeching loud enough to shake plaster from ceilings. Somewhere below, a mule brayed, and a man cursed in a voice rough with exhaustion. Gaius Marcellus lay awake on his straw mattress, staring at the cracked beams above him. His rented room was barely large enough for two people to sit without touching shoulders. Damp air clung to the walls. A cold draft slid through the open window hole, where a wooden shutter hung crooked like a broken jaw. He had not slept, not truly. Every time his eyes closed, the building seemed to creak as if it might collapse, and his mind filled with the same question. If fire comes tonight, will I run fast enough? Beside him, his daughter Livia slept curled under a thin cloth blanket, her small hands clutching a piece of bread as if even dreams might steal it. She was too young to understand why food had become uncertain, but old enough to notice when her father lied. Last night she had asked, "Will we eat tomorrow?" And Gaius had answered yes, because what else could a father say? He rose carefully, avoiding the clay chamber pot near the corner. The smell of stale waste mixed with smoke and old sweat. He lit his oil lamp, watching the flame tremble. The tiny light barely fought the darkness. Downstairs, the hallway was packed with other tenants already moving. Someone coughed hard deep in the lungs. Someone else argued with the landlord's slave about rent. Gaius descended the narrow staircase. The wood groaned under his weight. A single misstep could mean a fall all the way down. Outside, Rome hit him like a living beast. The smell was immediate. Animal dung, burned oil, sour wine, and wet stone. The alley was cramped, lined with leaning buildings that seemed to press inward like walls of a trap. Above, laundry hung from ropes between windows. Water, or worse, dripped from somewhere unseen. A baker's shop was already open. Warm bread scent drifted through the air like a cruel temptation. Gaius's stomach tightened. Bread meant coins. Coins meant favors. And favors meant the toga. He returned to his room, only long enough to pull it on. The toga was heavy and stiff, marking him as a citizen trapped in obligation. Today was the salutatio, the morning ritual, the performance of loyalty. He stepped back into the street, joining the flow of men moving toward the grand houses near the forum. Clients like him, shopkeepers, laborers, old soldiers with scars, walking with forced dignity toward their patron. The sky was beginning to lighten, pale gray over rooftops. The city's heartbeat grew louder. Gaius adjusted the folds of his toga and kept walking. If he arrived too late, he would receive nothing. And if he received nothing, then tomorrow his daughter's question would no longer be something he could answer with a lie. The streets near the forum were wider but not calmer. As Gaius Marcellus approached the district of the wealthy, the alleys opened into crowded lanes packed with bodies. Men in clean tunics pushed past beggars wrapped in rags. Slaves hurried with baskets balanced on their shoulders. A priest in white robes walked through the crowd as if the chaos parted for him by instinct. The city was waking fully now. Above the rooftops, smoke rose in thin gray ribbons from thousands of cooking fires, though not from Gaius's building. In the insulae, cooking was forbidden. Fire was too common, too deadly, too final. Yet the rich cooked freely, their kitchens guarded by stone walls and private wells. Their homes smelled of herbs and roasting meat, while Gaius's room smelled of damp straw and fear. Ahead, the patron's house stood like a fortress of marble and power. Tall columns framed a doorway wide enough for 3 men to enter at once. Lanterns still burned beside the entrance, even though the morning sun had begun to show itself. 2 armed slaves stood guard, their expressions empty, but their eyes alert. A line had already formed. Gaius took his place behind an elderly man whose hands shook as he clutched the edge of his toga. In front of him, a younger client adjusted his sandals nervously, as if appearing poor might be mistaken for disrespect. No one spoke loudly. They saved their voices for flatteries. The door opened. A slave stepped out and called names, his voice sharp as a whip. One by one, clients were allowed inside. Gaius waited. His throat felt dry. The man behind him muttered, "If the grain ships don't arrive soon, the city will tear itself apart." Gaius didn't respond, but his stomach clenched. Everyone had heard the rumors. The Egyptian shipments were delayed. Weather, pirates, politics, no one knew. But the markets already smelled blood. Prices rose like flames. The old man in front of him whispered, "Trajan wins wars, but can he fill bellies?" Then it was Gaius's turn. A slave looked him up and down, as if measuring his worth, and waved him inside. The air changed immediately. Outside, Rome smelled like sweat and smoke. Inside, it smelled like clean water, perfumed oil, and polished stone. The atrium ceiling opened to the sky, letting sunlight pour onto a shallow pool in the center. A statue of a god stood above it, painted, not white. The god's eyes were dark glass, almost alive. Gaius walked carefully, keeping his posture straight, his gaze lowered in practiced humility. His patron sat near the far end, speaking with two men who looked far wealthier than any client. Their togas were bright, their sandals new. They laughed softly at something the patron said. Gaius nodded too, though his mind was elsewhere, on Livia's thin arms, on his empty cupboard, on the taste of cheap bread. At last, Cassianus lifted a hand, signaling the conversation was over. A slave stepped forward holding small baskets. The sportula. Gaius held out his hands. The slave placed a modest bundle into his arms. Bread, a piece of dried sausage, and a small pouch of copper coins. Not much, but enough to survive one more day. Gaius bowed again. "You honor me, patron." Cassianus was already speaking to someone else. Outside, the crowd swallowed Gaius instantly. He clutched the basket tight against his chest, guarding it like treasure. A man without protection could be robbed before he reached the next street. The sun climbed higher, the city grew louder, and now Gaius had only one goal: turn this small mercy into dinner. By late morning, Rome was no longer waking. It was roaring. The streets near the Forum became a river of bodies flowing in every direction. Merchants shouted prices from wooden stalls. Donkeys dragged carts piled with amphorae. Children darted between legs like rats in a granary. Above it all, the constant hammering of construction echoed. Trajan's Rome was always building, always expanding, always swallowing stone and men alike. Gaius moved carefully through the crowd, keeping one arm wrapped around his basket. He did not trust the hands around him. Rome was full of citizens, but it was also full of hunger, and hunger turned even neighbors into thieves. The bread in his basket was warm. The smell made his stomach twist. He could have eaten it right there, standing among the shouting traders, but he didn't, not yet. Livia came first. He turned into a side street where the noise dimmed slightly. Here, the walls were covered in writing, political slogans, crude insults, and promises of gladiator games. Someone had painted a picture of a man with a donkey's head and written beneath it, "Marcus sleeps with goats." Gaius almost smiled. Rome's humor was as sharp as its knives. A man selling olives called out, "Fresh from Hispania, better than your wife's cooking." Another voice answered, "That's not a high standard." Laughter rolled through the crowd. Gaius pushed onward, passing a row of small food shops, thermopolia, where steam rose from clay pots built into counters. The scent of lentils, garlic, and cheap wine floated through the air. Working people ate here because they had no kitchens. Even those who could cook often chose not to. Why waste time and risk fire when a hot meal could be bought for a few coins? Gaius stopped at one stall where an old woman stirred a pot of thick bean stew. "How much?" he asked. "2 asses for a bowl," she replied without looking up. He hesitated, The coins in his pouch felt too light. Everything felt too expensive these days, but his daughter had eaten little the night before. "Give me half," he said.
Please, sir, just a small bowl. My family hasn't eaten in days. I swear I'll pay you.
All right, man. Take this.
The woman snorted. "Half a bowl still costs 2 asses. I don't sell air." Gaius sighed and handed over the coins. She filled a clay cup and pushed it toward him. He ate standing. The stew was hot and salty, heavy with cheap grain. Not delicious, but it filled the emptiness inside him like wet stones. Around him, other men ate quickly, eyes always scanning, hands always guarding their food. No one relaxed in Rome, unless they were rich enough to pay for safety. As he finished, a commotion rose from the street. 2 men were shouting. One grabbed the other by the collar. "You cheated me," the first man yelled. "Your weights are false." The merchant protested loudly, but the crowd had already gathered like vultures. Some wanted justice, others wanted entertainment. A few were already looking for a chance to steal from distracted pockets. Gaius stepped away. Trouble was contagious. He walked deeper into the market district where stalls sold everything from wool to bronze tools. At a grain seller's booth, he stopped and listened. A man asked, "What's the price today?" The seller answered, "Higher, always higher." "How much?" "4 sesterces for a measure."
Here is your grain. The cost is 10 sesterces.
10. But that is 3 times the usual price. We cannot pay that.
The man cursed. "That was 2 last month." The seller shrugged. "Complain to the sea winds, or to Egypt. I don't control the ships." A woman nearby whispered, "People say there will be riots if the grain doesn't arrive." Another answered, "Riots? There are always riots. Rome feeds itself on anger." Gaius felt cold despite the sun. He imagined the city turning violent, crowds storming warehouses, fires spreading, the insulae collapsing in panic. If Rome's hunger grew, men like him would be crushed first. He tightened his grip on the basket and began walking back toward his district. He had food for tonight, but he knew the truth. In Rome, having food today only meant you could worry about tomorrow. By afternoon, the heat of Rome pressed down on the city like a heavy wool cloak. Dust rose from the streets and clung to the backs of men and women as they hurried to finish errands before the sun forced them inside. The market buzzed with life, but Gaius had done all he could there for now. It was time for the one sanctuary he allowed himself, a visit to the baths. Grand Roman baths exterior, marble columns shining under sunlight, enormous entrance, realistic architectural details, tourists and citizens entering, cinematic historical style. Pools reflected the sky, turning it into a floating ceiling of blue and white. The sound of water echoed over the tiled floors, and steam rose like faint ghosts from the heated rooms. Gaius paid the small entrance fee, a coin barely worth the journey, and entered the changing room. The smell of olive oil and sweat was thick. Men of every size and shape milled about, moving with strange familiarity, naked yet not embarrassed. It was a place of equality, a rare pause in a city defined by social hierarchy. He undressed, careful to keep his belongings in a wooden locker. For a few moments he felt naked, not just in body but in responsibility. The ritual began. First, the tepidarium, a warm room where the steam opened pores and softened muscles. Men stretched and spoke quietly, their voices low in reverence or gossip. Gaius ran his fingers along the wall, tracing cracks in the stone that had been repaired countless times. Everything in Rome bore the mark of human effort, whether grand or insignificant. Next, the caldarium, the hot room, where steam became nearly solid. Breathing was a labor. Sweat poured freely. A slave smeared olive oil over Gaius's back and arms, massaging away the grime of the streets. He felt himself loosen in ways he hadn't since the night before. The scraping came last. Using the strigil, Gaius removed oil, sweat, and the invisible residue of urban life. For 20 minutes, he was not a client, not a laborer, not a man anxiously watching grain shipments. He was merely Gaius Marcellus, a body among bodies, free for a moment in a world built on hierarchy. He moved to the cold plunge pool, letting the water shock him back into consciousness. Sunlight glittered on the surface, refracting through the steam. Around him, children of men far wealthier than he darted and splashed, their laughter high and careless. He felt a pang of longing. His daughter would never swim here, not with what little coin he had. Yet even here, the city intruded. The loud grunts of men lifting weights, the occasional argument over space, the slapping of sandals against wet floors, all reminders that Rome never fully stopped. Drenched and exhausted, Gaius dressed again. He felt renewed but wary. Beyond the walls of the baths, the streets waited with their noise and chaos, their endless demands. He took a deep breath, feeling the city press close again. It was alive in every sense, merciless, vibrant, terrifying, necessary. And tomorrow, like every day, he would face it all again. Hunger, danger, performance, survival. But for now, the illusion of peace had done its work. And tomorrow, like every day, he would face it all again. Hunger, danger, performance, survival. But for now, the illusion of peace had done its work. Torches flickered in the homes of the wealthy. Oil lamps glimmered faintly where slaves carried them through narrow halls. Everywhere else, darkness reigned. Gaius Marcellus tightened his cloak around his shoulders as he stepped back into the streets. The basket of food he had secured from his patron and the market pressed against his chest. Livia waited for him, and he could not afford carelessness. One misstep, one opportunistic thief, and the night could take everything. The streets had changed since morning. The city's roar had softened into a tense murmur, punctuated by distant shouts, the clatter of carts, and the occasional braying of an animal. Rome slept little, and those who did not could prey on those who did. Gaius knew which side he wanted to be on. Passing under the shadows of the insulae, he remembered the precariousness of his home. One fire, one unlucky strike, could turn his tiny room into ashes and his family into smoke. He walked faster, guided by memory and instinct, eyes always scanning the dark shapes around him. Near the forum, a group of young men argued violently over a spilled crate of fruit. The sound drew a small crowd. Gaius did not stop. He had learned long ago that curiosity in Rome's alleys could be costly. Better to keep moving, to blend into the crowd, to become invisible. By the time he reached his insula, the city's nightlife had fully taken hold. The sound of carts rolling over stone, iron rims screeching in protest, echoed endlessly. Somewhere below, a lamp had tipped into straw, sending sparks up like tiny shooting stars. Gaius shivered and quickened his pace. Fire, always fire, was the constant terror of Rome's densest neighborhoods. He entered the building and climbed the stairs carefully. Each groan of wood beneath his feet reminded him of the fragility of his life. In his room, Livia slept, a small, peaceful bundle. Gaius set the basket down beside her and quietly laid out the modest meal. Bread, a piece of sausage, and a small portion of the beans from the thermopolium. For a moment, he allowed himself to breathe. The city's pressures, hunger, danger, performance, obligation, couldn't touch him here. Livia ate without complaint, her eyes brightened. And for a fleeting instant, Rome's relentless chaos seemed distant. Yet he knew it would return. Tomorrow the carts would screech again. Merchants would shout. Grain ships might still be delayed. The Salutatio would demand his loyalty. The market would test his vigilance. And the insula would settle and creak, a reminder that safety was always an illusion. Gaius lay down beside Livia, listening to the night outside. Somewhere a dog barked. Somewhere, someone argued. Somewhere a cart crashed against the curb. The city was alive, as it had been for thousands of years. A breathing, relentless monster of stone, wood, and human ambition. And in that moment, he understood what kept the people of Rome alive. Not wealth, not comfort, not certainty, but the small victories of endurance. A meal, a roof, a daughter's laughter. The world might crush them, but every day they survived was a triumph against the impossible. He closed his eyes, holding Livia's hand. Tomorrow he would rise again. The streets would roar, the carts would scream, and the city would demand everything as it always had. But tonight, he allowed himself a brief defiance of Rome's unending demands. Tonight he survived.